We are live. Yes, we are live. Brian should be on any moment. He's dealing with. He's in Michigan right now, so yeah. Don't worry, he'll be on soon enough. Yeah. So the show. Up, Brian. There he is. Can you hear me, Brian?
Yeah, give me 1 sec, Patrick.
Yeah. Okay. Here, I'll. Gotta love it. Love it when you go live. Hello, Audrey. We got about 10 people, 12 people watching us live. Brian's microphone's on mute. Part of the disadvantages of traveling so much is sometimes the equipment doesn't tune up whenever you're at home. But anyways, yeah, so we're gonna go over the his all-time rankings.
How's that?
That's better. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Or me? Yeah. I was explaining to our listeners that with all the traveling, it's hard to have a reliable setup, and sometimes you just got to start from scratch. Sometimes.
Oh, yeah, all good. Yeah, I'm at the Teen Fitness Ranch, so it's my first time here. They're checking in some athletes for competition. Some of the divisions are starting tomorrow, so they're all just showing up now and checking in. So I apologize for being a minute or two late. I was just talking to one of them.
It's quite all right. I'm sure everyone's fine. Yeah, so you're actually at the venue there, at the affiliate right there, where everything's going to happen. I believe the JV division is what's checking in today, and then the I guess what do you want to call it? The varsity division checks in tomorrow. But oh shoot! All right, let's. You know what? Let's just jump right into it, Brian. Obviously, you've seen the comments. So today, we released last night and this morning, we released your all-time rankings. Hold on a second. The all-time rankings, and we did it. You did it. It's basically a top 40 for men and women, and it's your all-time rankings. I mean, it has nothing to do with eras. And let's first talk about the criteria. Well, actually, Brian, you just go ahead and you start however you want to explain these rankings.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's cool that people are interacting with it. It's great to see, questions, comments, critiques. I've been doing this for years. Like, this is not a new list.
Mm-hmm.
If you have taken the time to look closely at the list or go to the article or look at the graphics that PC has put there on the Instagram, you'll see that there's very few new athletes that have made their way onto the list this year.
Yeah.
If you haven't been, paying attention to the stuff that I've been doing for as long, and this is brand new to you, then obviously everyone is going to be new in your mind. But I mean, obviously a lot of people on this list did not compete at the CrossFit Games this year, and many of them haven't competed at the CrossFit Games in a long time, or at least in the individual division. And I think that that's got to be the first place that we start, is to acknowledge that this is a ranking based on athletes' performance at the CrossFit Games only,
Mm-hmm.
as an individual over the duration of their career. And there's a few reasons why I decided to do that. And the first is that I don't have the full set of data for the teams, and I would love to. I think, as far as I know, there's only one person that does. I think it's Chad Schroeder. And I'm not sure if that information is his or if it's CrossFit's, and I don't have access to it. So I can't add it. If you want to include Rich's, because that's obviously where the conversation goes when you start talking about teams. If you want to include Rich's performance in the teams, then you have to also consider like Adam Neifert, who's competed at the CrossFit Games as part of a team, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And then there are other people that want to talk about Rich's successes coach or a programmer relative to Fraser's, which we'll obviously get into that conversation. But it's like, well, then you have to, are you telling me that Adam Neifert's success should be on this list and not only ranked as an athlete, but also as a coach of that affiliate? So maybe you should get twice the credit. Plus, he's coached Justin Majerus to 2 titles. Why isn't Adam Neifert number 3 on the list, 2 on the list, 1 on the list? Like his credentials as a coach, plus an athlete, plus a coach at different stages of his career. So, and if you open this up, then you got guys like Kyle Kasperpower, one of the only guy who's podiumed at the games as a team, individual and masters athlete. And most of the people that are suggesting these things probably don't even have any idea who Adam Neifert is, especially as an athlete, maybe not as a coach or an affiliate owner. They probably only know of him as Justin Medeiros' coach. And of course, there are some people who will know him well. They're probably from his affiliate or have been diehard fans of the sport for a long time, and they'll know that he's coached an invitational team and that this guy is deeply ingrained in the sport. But there's not a good record of all of that stuff right now. It's something that I'm working on, and it's the first reason why I don't factor the team, masters, teenage, or any other parts of the season, including semifinals, quarterfinals, or open, into these things. Now, occasionally you get to some place on the list and you look at a few people and you're like, wow, it's really tight, it's really difficult, and you might say like, okay, well, yeah, this person has done this and this person done this, and just at the games on their own they're very close, so they're next to each other on the ranking, which one goes ahead of them. And in an isolated setting like that, then I might evaluate some things outside of the games if I happen to know that they've competed against each other many times at a Dubai or Wadapalooza over the years, or various things like this. This is for breaking a tie between two athletes, so to speak, a tie between two athletes in a vacuum. It's not, it's, first of all, it's extremely difficult to do this as it is, because there's constantly more athletes. The sport's constantly evolving. How do you assess errors against each other? One of the first things you said was that it's absent of error. Like, I try to factor in this blanket statement is that all any athlete could do is show up and compete against the people that were there. But as some people in the comments point out, in certain years, the number of athletes competing was different. In other years, the quality of athletes competing was different. How do you assess Laura's win this year when the only 2 women who beat her last year weren't in the competition? How do you assess Justin Medeiros' titles that came right after Matt Fraser retired, when he was still obviously the best guy in the world? Like, do you factor those things in or not? There's a million different questions and variables there. And and while I do appreciate the comments that people have, I think that more often than not, those comments are emotion driven and based on an immediate reaction to seeing something, rather than spending years in the tank trying to evaluate athletes' actual performance against their competitors during the time that they were competing. And I know that I'm not going to get it perfectly right, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give every athlete on this list their due cause in terms of, they competed there for 5 years. I'm not just going to blink of an eye and say, yep, they're 18th on the list. Well, why are they 18th on the list? And it's, in a podcast like this, like, I don't know if we'll be able to go through every athlete and answer that question.
Sure. Yeah.
But I've, I want people to know that I'm not just haphazardly throwing names on the list. I'm not just, I try really hard not to let emotion factor into those decisions. I try to look at the facts, which is this athlete did this for this amount of years at the CrossFit Games, and how does that stack up to an athlete who did that for that amount of years at the CrossFit Games?
No, and I think you explained that pretty well. And but whenever you come up with a list or a chart, it doesn't matter what sport. There's always going to be opinions, and that's why this is your list. This isn't CrossFit's list. This isn't anyone else's list. And there's a reason why people aren't putting out that many lists, because they're not opening themselves up. They don't want to open themselves up to the criticism. And there's always going to be criticism anytime you make a list. And I think another thing is when you make the argument about teams, I don't see anyone making arguments about Andrea Nisler and Taylor Williamson being on the list for the women for being the top 40 CrossFit women all the time. I mean, if you use that argument that people are using regarding Rich, you can claim that those women have had multiple podiums and 2 championships. How come they're not in the top 40? I mean, so I think that's how people kind of look at it. I know and I understand. There's a lot of emotion involved, and there's also stuff, and something I'll bring up to you later when we get into the discussion, when we start actually getting into the list, is recency bias. I think that's also something that we have need to take in consideration. That's something that I'm obviously going to bring up to you because there are some new names. There's 4 new names that popped up and combined in both lists, men and women, 3 on the men, 1 in the women. But there have been some major changes, some not some significant changes in bringing up like Laura Horvath. So with that in mind, I think we should start with the women because what I want to do is the main argument that people are going to have is Rich versus Matt. I want to save that for later. So that way you guys have to all listen and you know listen for a little bit and listen to what we have to say before we move on to that main subject. So let's start off with the women. You basically discussed what you talked about in terms of your criteria. Pretty simple. It's only updated following the CrossFit Games each year. So you've done this for several years. It only factors what happened at the CrossFit Games in each athlete's career. That's very important. We're not talking about rogue. You're not looking at the any off-season competitions, Dubai, any competitions like athletes must compete in a minimum of 3 CrossFit Games to even be eligible for the consideration on that list. So that's why you will not see names like Mal O'Brien, Alex Gazan, Emma Lawson on these lists right now because right now, based on Brian's criteria, they're not eligible. They will next year if they make it to the games next year. Appearances, champions, podiums, top 10 finishes, you put those weigh heavily for you when you consider these rankings. The average finish, excluding some WD years. What's WD?
Withdraws. So
Which
like there's it's a good example for like if
era?
you just were to look at average finishes during a CrossFit Games career, Dan Bailey ranks way ahead of Josh Bridges. The reason being is Josh competed later into his career and he had a few places in the 30s that weighed down his average finish. Is that going to count against him? So you have to evaluate that. Or you look at someone like Annie Thorsdottir, who had to withdraw in 2015. So she has like a 37th place to her credit when the rest of her years are like, 1, 2, 3, 7, 10, 13. And then there's this 37. Are you going to factor that in? Miko Saylor is another one where he's got like a first, a 7th, a 10th, and then a 38th. He had to withdraw. He didn't even show up that year or whatever it was. So in a few scenarios, I do look at that and I say, okay, if they've only competed 4 years, 3 of them were really good, one of them was a withdraw. Am I really going to count that against Miko? How heavily am I going to count that? And again, I'm waiting. Miko's down there on the list somewhere because even though he's a champion, he's got a few appearances. One of which was a withdraw, and he competed a long time ago.
And then finally, wrapping up event wins and then the era years competed during relative to strength of field. So let's work our way backwards here, Brian. So we're going to start off with going to kind of go through all this. Bear with us here. All right, starting with
And
40.
I'll just say I don't have, because I'm on the road, and I don't have a full setup here. Like I don't have all of the stats in front of me that I usually would if I
Sure.
was home to reference all these things. But I will do my best to give context to any of the questions you or anyone else has.
Yeah. So he'll try your best, and I think people understand that. Okay, starting from 31 to 40. I think the biggest change here is Emily Rolfe, who moved up. I believe she was on 40th in last year's rankings and moved up to 32. She's the biggest jump. Um, and is that because of her performance this past year? I mean, obviously she's someone that's been to multiple games, over 3, and she's her best finish this past year. And she's probably another person that you were talking about withdrawals. She had a withdrawal last year. So how much of that, knowing last year her having the withdrawal versus her having a whole games, how much did that factor into her moving up 8 spots?
Yeah, I mean Emily Rolfe is there's a lot of great things to say about Emily Rolfe. Obviously, she had her best year at the games this year, and last year we didn't necessarily get to find out what she's been able to do. Her first appearance at the games was 2019. She got cut in that year, so we didn't get to see the full breadth of her fitness, but she had a decent finish. The game site lit just so useless in this regard, but she was 18th. She comes in 2021. She finishes 15th. She was 12th this year, and then she had a withdrawal last year. So if you're looking at the 3 times she completed the games, 12, 15, 18, she's averaging a 15th place finish at the games in the years that she's able to do it, and she's qualified 1 extra year than that. She has 3 event win over, in those 3 years that she's competed. 1 event win per year is pretty good. It's pretty rare for athletes anywhere on the leaderboard to be able to get an event win every year that they show up at the games. And she's doing it more recently. And it is, I think that I wouldn't say that every year the field necessarily gets better and deeper. When like this year compared to last year is a good example or conversation of that on the women's side. You lost 5 women from the top 10. You lost 9 of the top 19, I think, from last year who weren't in the
Hmm.
games field this year. Obviously, there were other athletes that did enter into the games field this year, like Emma Carey, Annie Thorzar, Katrin David's daughter, Jamie Simmons. So it's like Bethany Flores, like, do they balance each other out? You have Alex Kazan and Ariel Lowe and Alexis Raptis, who are obviously better this year than they were last year. So is this games field stronger than last year's, or is it weaker because you're missing Tia, you're missing Haley, you're missing Mal, you're missing Danny Spiegel, you're missing Christy Aramola. There's a lot there. There's a lot missing, Lucy Campbell, et cetera, et cetera. So not every year necessarily gets better, but in general, Emily Rolfe has competed in 2019, 2021, and 2023 games fields, which were fairly competitive fields overall, and she's done quite well. She's continuing to get better as the years go on, and I think that if you're assessing her performance relative to the women in this region, she has a better and worse average event finish than some of them. A few women that are below her do have top 10 finishes, or in the case of like a Carrie Kepler podium finish, it's Elena Fortunato podium finish that she doesn't have. So she doesn't necessarily win every category, and it's a great place to start in this conversation because it's an example um, of trying to assess all of those criteria that you talked about in one microcosm. So she's got a relatively short career at a relatively competitive period of time. She's shown excellence at the games in certain things, and she has and then you're stacking her up against some people who've been there for a long time, many years in the case of Turi Helgadottir, but have maybe never reached that potential. Do you value the longevity over the brevity of a career when the athlete's done a little bit better? So in this case, if you look at the women that are listed here, with the exception of Stacy Tovar, after I sat down and looked at this for every single athlete there that I moved her ahead of, and I said, yeah, I think that what she's done at this point is a representation of an overall better individual CrossFit Games athlete than each of the women below her.
Yeah. Um, Another big jump is Bethany Shadburn. Um, she's an interesting case. Again, bringing up the withdrawals because obviously she's had injuries. She had a withdrawal due to COVID 1 year. Um, I mean, just her performance this year moved her up 3 more spots from where you had her, which was 37th. Do you recall where she was 3 years ago? If she was around that range, or how high was Bethany at one point in your rankings?
Well, it's so really the only way that athletes going to move backwards on the list is if someone passes them, as unless if they're not competing. If they are
Mhm.
competing, and let's just like Justin Medeiros is an interesting case in this regard. His first 3 years of the games were third, first, but it's only 3 years, and I could have after those 3 years been like, well, he's only this third person ever to have 2 championships, so he's third all time. End of story. And it's like, yeah, but that's risky. Like, what if he shows up the next year and he finishes 13th? What if he shows up the year after that and he's 25th? And what if he never makes it again? Then
Yeah.
is that really a better career than Ben Smith? Is that really a better career than Jason Kleepa, Scott Panchik, Pat Vellner, that have this
Mhm.
consistency over time, even though they're just 1 or 2 notches below him in terms of their best performances? When you look at Bethany Shadburn, it's like a fascinating kind of trajectory of her career. Besides 2017 when she was 22nd, she's been in the top half of the field every single time that she's competed there. On the flip side of that, she's got these like not great, like 2019, 2020, she had a great finish in 2019 of 8th, but that year is difficult to assess for many different reasons that had nothing to do with the athletes, just about the choices that the competition team made about how to score events, weight events, make cuts, and evaluate fitness supposedly against what was a super deep field, a very
Mhm.
talented field. But I've had this conversation on many platforms before. Like, you could just pull the top 10 from first cut of that year, and I think it's a better representation of the top 10 fittest women in the world, men or women in the world, than the final 10 at the games. And there's a
Yeah.
reason for that. And it's which we're not really going to dive into. And then she had a bad finish in 2020 in the online games, 20th. That's in the bottom third of the field. Same with Laura Horvath. She had a bad finish that year. In general, my perspective, and it will always be this way, is I'm far more interested in what any athlete can do in live competition than what they can do online. I don't really care if you're the person that wins the Worldwide Open and the Worldwide quarterfinals and shows up to semifinals and can't make the games. That's all I need to know about you.
Yeah.
And so I don't really weigh heavily negative or poor performances from the 2020 season. Bethany's probably fittest year was in 2021, and she didn't get a chance to show it. I believe she would have been in the top 10 that year, but I
Mhm.
can't really factor that in when I'm evaluating her. The fact that she was able to come back 2 years later and take 15th place at the game, it's at the games, and it's really difficult to know fully how healthy she is or isn't. I think justifies her placement inside the top 40. She has qualified for the game 6 times. It's nothing, that's 6 of the last 7 years without counting 2022. She does relatively well when she gets there, and she's relatively low on the list out of 40, but I think she's certainly deserving of a place on it.
Fair enough. Hey, I wanted to say thank you, Jacqueline, for the $10. Really appreciate that. It's been up there for a while, but yeah, definitely appreciate the support. Um, Moving on from the bottom 10, I don't hate to say bottom 10 because our 40 through 31st. Moving on to 21 through 30th, we have our lone new entry, and that's Ariel Owen, who just finished on the podium this past year, her third year at the games, her third straight year at the games, and she finished in third place. And she comes in at number 23, Michael Jordan's number. I mean, how did how did you decide on 23?
Yeah, that was just it. I just was like, I love her and I love MJ, so it's perfect.
Yep,
No.
I figured.
And that's the extent of it. That's all the thought I gave to these things. Um, yeah, Ariel, I did think I see a few comments with regards to Ariel. I was trying to look through all the comments. There are quite a few. Some
Mhm.
people may be happy she's on the list where she is. Others may be sad. She's thinking she should be a little bit higher. Oh, Ariel herself made a comment there. Tear and heart. I don't know what that means. Okay.
I think
Obviously,
she's happy.
as Halpin says there, obviously she's trending up. It
Yeah.
is cool when you see an athlete who shows up to the games and gets better every year. Her rankings over the last 3 seasons have been 14th, 11th, and 3rd, which is very good. Excuse me. Um, Sorry. And that gives her an average finish of just inside the top 10, with obviously the third weighing, quite heavily. Of all of the athletes that are ahead of her, I think the lowest placing average finish is like 11th. Oh no, there's Rebecca Voigt. It's actually
Mhm.
17th,
Yep.
which is an outlier relative to anyone else. So her average finish is on par with. I mean, look, there's also like Julie Fouché, who averages better than 4th, and she's only 14th on the list. Becca Voigt averages 17th, and she's 60th on the list. So you're not just going to factor average finish as the only metric, right? But it is notable, and it means that she hasn't shown up to the games and had a bad performance yet. Additionally, she's done it against a relatively good field. There was a comment that someone made, I think it was on the men's side, that says, I think it was with response to the question about Justin Medeiros being low at 7th place,
Mhm.
is that that I do factor longevity into this thing. I you know it's great to have a 3 or 4 year career at the games and to do well every year. You can think
Yep.
about the Marcus Hendrons, the Julie Fouchés, the Dan Baileys. He only had 5 years at the games, Dan, but he's more or less inside the top 10. I think he was 6th to 10th every single year that he showed up there. But when you put that down on paper against people that have 9, 10, 11 appearances, you're like, wow. And then think about that. Like, think about how hard it is for one athlete to make the games ever, and then to do it 10 times. Like, you can't just throw that out. You have to give some merit to it. So a lot of the women, and this is true, like a lot of the women that are on the case, or that are on, in the maybe the 10 spots ahead of Ariel Lowen, have a significant number of appearances relative to her. She has 3. Val Vobral's ahead of her. She has 5. Pacelli has 8. Barnard has 6. Daniel Brandon and Gabby McGowan have 5 each. Same with Jamie Simmons, and their average finishes are at or better than that. Rebecca Voigt 10, Camille LeBlanc 9. You have a few outliers like Julie Fouché and Haley Adams that have 4 each, but their average finish is much better. 6 and 4. So and this is probably where the recency bias really comes into play. There are going to be some people that are massive Ariel Lowen fans that have been for the time that they've been following CrossFit, which is 3 years, that may not know anything about Julie Fouché. And Ariel's, I think, is I mean, she's one of the nicest people that I've ever met. She's an incredibly likable person that it's easy to gravitate towards. It's easy to root for, and even though she's had this like very good career over the last 3 years, she's like a bit of an underdog. And so
Hmm.
there might be people who think that she's never getting her due, and so they really want to stand up and speak loudly for her. And I, am one of those people. Someone asked me some of my highlights of the games.
We lost Brian there for a second. Michael, Brian, give some insight on Amanda. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know what that was. Someone asked me about some of my highlights from the games the other day when I was back in Chicago visiting some friends, and one of the things I said was like, well, I didn't know it was going to happen, but the last workout I did before the CrossFit Games was with Ariel Lowen, and she ended up going on to take third, third place at the games. So that was kind of cool to like work out with a podium finishing athlete before that. But that person was asking about Amanda Barnhart specifically. Michael Guest,
Yeah,
what a great picture.
it is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Barnhart, six appearances at the game, so she's got twice as many appearances. She's got 3 times as many finishes inside the top 10. She does have a couple finishes lower than Ariel's lowest finish, and obviously this year was her I think it was her worst that she's ever had, without pulling that up necessarily to verify. But twice as many appearances, 3 times as many times in the top 10. How do you weight that against someone who has one podium finish when the other one doesn't? So I'm valuing the longevity and consistency of Amanda slightly more than the one tremendous performance by Ariel this year. If Ariel comes back next year and backs it up with a third place finish, you can bet all your dollars that she'll be ahead of Amanda Barnhart on this list.
Yeah, and it could also change if Amanda comes back next year and records another top 10 finish. There might be she might make that distance between her and Ariel even instead of one spot, a couple spots. So, and that goes back to the longevity of you weighing longevity and consistency over a longer span than someone like Ariel, who it will be 4 years, versus Amanda, who would be 6. I mean, I think that would be 7 or 8 years for Amanda.
Yeah.
But Michael says thanks for the answers. That's what we're here. We have all the answers.
Well,
Really,
try.
really try. Uh, Moving on from that, that was basically I think the newest. I guess the big. Well, I do have. How does Emma McQuaid's performance this year? You only have her dropping back one spot based on her performance this year. Now, granted, she had to, she withdrew due to injury as well. But I mean, do you kind of give her a pass this year, and then like hopefully next year, next year will be basically the year that determines where she ranks in the overall grand scheme of things? Because obviously next year, we have brought it up, there are some athletes that are not on this list. So the Emma Lawsons, the Mal O'Briens, some of these other athletes who have because they haven't qualified for this list yet. So some of these athletes will be coming off the list based on whatever those athletes would do. So, but would Emma McQuaid be one of those athletes you would consider, like, I guess, on the chopping block?
No, I mean she's not gonna drop below other athletes on the list that aren't competing.
Sure.
It's like, she was at this spot on the list based on her previous 4 appearances, which are
Hmm.
2019 through 2022, 20th, 19th, 12th, and 12th, and relative consistency during that period of time. This year, yeah, it's the worst performance she's had at the CrossFit Games, and there are, this is probably the most difficult part about this, is that now I know a lot more about the athletes. So in the
Hmm.
case of an Emma McQuaid, I know the things that have been going on with her personally and physically this year that are preventing her from performing at the level that we've seen the last 2 years. Going back to the time period before I had a chance, before I was watching live, before I was able to ask athletes certain things, before I was able to talk to their coaches, before I was integrated into the competitive community in this way, there might be a year that Austin Malleol showed up to the games with a partially torn hamstring, and I have no idea. And the media wasn't the same then. There wasn't as much attention on as many athletes at that time, and CrossFit didn't care about people that were finishing outside of the first position or second position, really. And then, and so and the media was all centralized to CrossFit. So we were only getting the stories that either CrossFit put out or the athletes put out on their own. And a lot of the athletes didn't feel the need to put out the justification stories or whatever else in the way that they do now. So that I would say is probably the most difficult and potentially even impossible to a certain extent to accurately evaluate. But in the case of Emma McQuaid, it is a good example where I've seen what she can do consistently for a period of time. This year, I mean, quite frankly, she probably shouldn't have been competing. She was still
Mhm.
managed to get to the games that way. She still showed up and gave it her best shot, but it was, it's kind of like, she's competing, I would just say unhealthily.
Yeah.
and it showed in her performance. If she never competes again at the CrossFit Games, I still think she's worthy of a spot here in the 20s somewhere. And yes, when Mal O'Brien and Emma Lawson, if Mal O'Brien ever competes again, and if Emma Lawson, Emma Carey, Alex Kazan, Alexis Raptis, that's a lot of names that could push her down towards 30 at no fault of their own. It's just that there's going to always be new people entering into the list at some point.
Yeah.
So
Mhm. Well, we certainly hope that she keeps, she finds that path to recovery and comes back 100%, and actually, instead of, and gives an opportunity to move up the list as opposed to down. Moving up into the top 20 now. So we got 11 through 20. Let's just start. I think we can kind of almost hit on each one of these athletes. Yeah, Brooke Wells last year. Brooke Wells was 10th overall. She drops down one spot, and that's because and that probably has a couple factors in her dropping, which probably one, her not making the games this year, and probably also other people jockeying and moving into the top 10.
I was just one person, really. I
Yeah,
mean, the drop for her and Haley
Haley.
Adams is just because of Laura moving up.
Yep.
And so that's basically unchanged. And they both have great careers with what they've done already. Brooks being twice as long as Haley's, eight
Mhm.
appearances compared to 4. Look, there's only 12 total athletes in the history of the CrossFit Games, male and female combined, that have made the games 9 or more times as an individual. And Brooks at
Crazy.
8. So she's like, she's within the top 20 athletes all time, male plus female, that have been able to qualify for the CrossFit Games a specific number of times. That's pretty good. Additionally, she's got 4 top 10 finishes and 3 event wins with an average finish of 10th over 8 years. Like, those numbers speak pretty well. And
Mhm.
if you stack them up like I have against all the other athletes on the list, there are some interesting conversations. You know, Christy Aramo O'Connell is a couple spots below there. She also has 4 top 10 finishes. Her average finishing placement is also 10th. All of her finishes had been, in a very, very tight range, where Brooks had a little bit more of a spread. A few that were better, a few that were worse, but she's been to the games 8 times compared to Christie's 6. And so, to me, that extra 25%, that extra 2 years of commitment, of excellence, of being able to be good enough to get there, weighs into the conversation. And so, even though their average event finishes, their number of top tens are similar, Christie was more consistent over a small period of time. Brooke was slightly less inconsistent over a longer period of time, and I weigh that slightly better.
Yeah. The next two names on our list, you brought up Brooke, Haley, and Chrissy. You have Julie Fouché and Camille. Now, Julie Fouché, they both pretty much competed around the same era. And I guess we can call that the Carson era. That's basically when they pretty much peaked in terms of athletes. Those were their prime years. Camille won a championship. She won a title to fish. Julie Fouché, meanwhile, I believe only one podium during that time. But yet you have Julie Fouché ahead of someone like Camille.
Julie Fouché had a second and a third and two
Yep.
fourths, I believe. Her average event finish, I think that's right. It might have been a second,
Yeah.
third, fourth, fifth. I don't have 4
Yeah.
monitors or whatever to look at. But yeah, Julie was very consistent for a small period of time. When I just, like, in a very brief notes that I wrote, as good of a 4-year stretch as anyone who has never won a championship, but not enough longevity to be any higher on the list than she is. That was like the original note I made about Julie when I made this list a few years ago,
Mhm.
and I would say that still is, kind of, in just a small setting, that's kind of all you need to know about her. For the years that she was competing, she was excellent. But she competed, a decade ago now, basically. Um, and so, she's only going to move down this list, but I think that it's worth, it's worth mentioning and bringing up and letting people know that for a small period of time, she was a perennial podium threat at the games, and there's just not that many people that you can say that for, including
Hmm.
Camille LeBlanc-Bazinet.
Yeah.
Camille obviously has a lot of games appearances. I just get it right. Camille has 9 games appearances. She's one of those dozen athletes that's been to the games that many times, and her range of finishes is,
Mhm.
uh, it's from first all the way to 21st, with a
Mhm.
withdraw in 2017 that I don't really count against her.
Yeah.
She's got, I mean, it's a good resume on paper. Some of those finishes go back all the way to 2010. I mean, that was her first year at the game. She was already finishing inside the top 10. The landscape of the games field looked differently there. And then this is tough, because I mentioned in there that I assessed the strength of field, and there was this interesting stat about the women who competed at the CrossFit Games in 2014. First of all, probably the fittest woman on earth that year was Sam Briggs, and she didn't make it to the games because of the
Mhm.
handstand walking in the
Yes.
regionals. Arguably, the next fittest woman on earth that year was Cara Webb, and Cara Webb had a withdrawal this Sunday morning of the games. I've written and talked about this before. It was really tight between her and Camille. It was unclear who was going to win. A lot of people think Cara would have won. Either way, Camille would have been first or second. And so, I factor that when I'm thinking about Cara, I factor that in uh, as like a podium finish for her on her
Mhm.
resume. And obviously, I have Cara very high on this list, and some people might think I have her too high on the list, which is okay. But I count that championship for Camille. It's like you can't you got to kind of call it what it is. So
Mhm.
no one else on that list for a long time was able to do anything relevant at the games again. I can pull it up here. Just scrolling around a little bit. Annie Thorsdottir was second that year, and then she didn't have, the next couple of years she wasn't really, like, she had a few years wasn't doing as well before she had a resurgence. That was Julie Foucher's last year. That was Michelle Latendre's last year, or last relevant year. Same with Val Vobril, Emily Bridgers, Lauren Brooks, Cassie Lance McWhorter, Lauren Fisher, Jennifer Assel. Those were the top 10 women that year. And if you stack up those 10 women against some others, top 10 performances, even from the year before or the year after that, they look a little bit different on paper. And so, yes, Camille has a championship. And like I said in the beginning of this conversation, there's nothing that you can never take that away from an athlete. All they can do is show up and compete against the field that was there. But when you're assessing the totality of someone's career and you say, okay, they won that year, how did that happen? If you just look at her history, like, she was never close to winning before or after that. She
Yeah.
was, she had a sixth and eighth and a ninth in 2012, 12, 11, and 10 going backwards. And all the other finishes are outside of the top 10. So what happened in that year that she was suddenly significant? Like, we always talk about how much more difficult it is to be fifth than sixth, or third than fifth, or first than second. How could she just have this one year where she was first and all these other years where she couldn't crack the top 5, and in half of them she couldn't crack the top 10?
Mhm.
And that's where you if you're like unemotionally and reasonably asking that question, and you're like, okay, well, who'd she compete against that year? And you realize that it was a relatively weaker year than many of the other years that she competed, which is totally fine. Still want to give her credit for that. Still want to give her credit for the longevity. But I think that on paper, that championship might weigh a little bit more heavily for some than it does for me.
Um, I guess kind of in a similar situation without the championship is 2 spots behind her and Jamie Simmons, who has a top 10, a top podium finish in 2019. And then the last, obviously, she didn't make the games 2 years ago. And then this year she was there, was in a top 20. Some would argue that she was top 10 before she had to withdraw due to an injury. Did you kind of approach that the same way with Jamie that you did with Camille?
Yeah, I mean, if she'd been able to finish the games this year, I would have moved up like 1,000 spots on Tyler's Heat One app game. So that's why I put her. No, but that is true actually, because I picked her 10th. I think she would have been pretty close to there, and
Hmm.
but that's just like the nature of fantasy sports. And as far as her career goes, Jamie Simmons doesn't have the longevity as an individual competitor at the games as some of those athletes. Rebecca Voigt and Camila Blanc being ahead of her with 10 and 9 as individuals. Jamie has 5. Gabby, Danielle also have 5. Julie, Haley have 4. Christy has 6. So, like, 5 is still a solid number of appearances at the games. What kind of stands out for Jamie especially if you consider this year to be 10, 11, 12, something like that, which is where she likely would have finished. Then she's got like the 12th place in 2020 online is her worst ever finish, and it was online.
Mhm.
11th place in 2018, which was an ultra competitive year at the games. That's her other worst finish. Every other time she's been in the top 10. 8th in 2017, third in 2019, and then we'll see what happens this year. So
Yeah.
she has, I would say like an average amount of longevity, a very consistent output. But again, it's I'm not factoring, like, there are performances that Christy Aramo had at the games that weren't a podium finish that I think are just as impressive as Jamie's podium finish that year. So it's while I'm acknowledging that that is a podium finish for her, and as I said before, there's nothing she can do about it as an athlete. There
Mhm.
are certain things that I can look at and say, yeah, I don't think she would have finished on the podium that year if just the top 20 athletes, like if they just stopped cutting after 20 and let the rest of the women compete. That group of athletes had Laura Horvath, Annie Thorisdottir, uh, Karen Freyova, Danielle Brandon, Brooke Wells. Like, it was extremely stacked 11 through 20. And I feel that you saw Katrin, for example. She was the
Yeah.
last one in, climb all the way up to fourth over that period of time. And I think that you would have seen a lot of shifting in the leaderboard. Half of the competition was still remaining, and you removed half of the best athletes in the world based on a system that was completely flawed. So Jamie's credentials are great. Her performance that year was great. Her performance in general at the games is great. And, top 20 is, I think, more than fair for her.
Yeah. Right behind her, with probably the second biggest jump, besides, well, it might be the third biggest jump, is Gabby, moving up 2 spots from 22 to 18. Um, I mean, I think with her, it's like, how much upside does Gabby have um, from this point? I mean, she got, I guess she finished sixth last year, and then this year she comes back with
2 years ago. 2
2
years
years
ago.
ago. Yeah, 2 years ago.
She had this little like up down. So,
Yeah.
first of all, she's been making the game since 2019.
Mhm.
2019, she couldn't really do legless rope climbs, so she got cut in the first workout.
Yeah.
So we have no real data on her from that year.
Mhm.
Next year was online. She was 18th. Again, I would say this is, they're there, but really we're looking at 2021, 22, 23, where she was sixth, eighth, and fourth. So she's averaging a sixth place per finish over 3 years, although she's qualified for the games 5 years. And that's
Mhm.
kind of what I'm looking at there. Her upside is great. I would say she's still young and she still has a potential to get better. I mean, I do think she's making improvements. There was like her performance, her finish this year, though, was like, these are small nuanced things, but I don't think Laura Horvath was trying to win the final event. I think she was
Mhm.
embracing the moment, realizing what she was about to accomplish, something she's been
Yeah.
chasing for 6 years now. And so she kind of just soaked it all in. That performance allowed her basically tanking that performance and allowed for some point to go Gabby's way that projected her ahead of Gazan, who otherwise would have beaten her. I think it was only 2 points. And if Laura
Mhm.
had just won the workout, Gabby would have got a few less. And I think Alex would have got fourth to her fifth. So, those are just little things to give maybe some people some insight into stuff that I'm observing and considering when doing this that doesn't necessarily show up on paper.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the last 3 years of the games is a very competitive field. She's consistently inside the top 10. She's been good enough to make the games for 5 consecutive years. She's moved out from outside the top 20 to inside the top 20. Her and Danielle Brandon actually have almost identical resumes, 5 years at the games, three top 10 finishes. Gabby averages a ninth, and kind of quote unquote, if you take out that 88th from 2019, which was based on one workout, and Danielle
Yeah.
Brandon averages 10th. So, like, Daniel has a few more event wins than Gabby, obviously being a specialist in some specific things. So they're very close on paper, and that's why they're very close on the rankings here. They're obviously both still competing, and I think each of them has a trajectory to improve as an athlete and improve on these rankings.
Speaking of DB, if she obviously she has a tenth in the 2019 games. What do you think her rankings might have been if she would have been actually been able to compete with those top 10 athletes, including Jamie Simmons and some of those other athletes? Because obviously there's a failed drug test that year. But do you think her ranking would be a little bit more higher than this? Or would you said you didn't really factor in 2019 too much, but how much would 2019 weigh into that if she would have been able to make the top 10 and kept her weekend going?
Yeah. So she missed. She was 11th. She was the last one to be cut, and Anna Fragkow failed her drug test that year. So
Yeah.
she shows up as 10th, even though she didn't get to do the last 6 tests. That's what Patrick's referring to for anyone who
Mhm.
doesn't know. And yeah, I mean, it would have been really nice to see her finish out the weekend and get that spotlight. You know, performance enhancing drugs, drug tests, whatever, are just, they're part of sports. They're an unfortunate part of sports, and in my opinion, it's just another reason why it's risky to have the cuts, is for some, for a scenario like this. But yeah, I think that would have put Danielle Brandon on the map a little bit earlier. She would have, I think, done well. If you look at some of the workouts
Yeah.
coming up over the weekend, there was,
Swimming
swimming
workout.
hadn't happened yet. What?
The swimming workout.
Yeah, swimming was late in the weekend. I think she would have done well on the split triplet that was right after that. Um, so she maybe takes a hit on the clean, but overall, I think she would have moved up from 10th relative to the athletes that were remaining there, maybe been 8th or 7th, and also have gotten, basically one more year of exposure. So yeah, maybe she'd be, one or two spots higher at most, but you're talking about, the only athletes in that range right now are Gabby and Jamie. So I still think she'd be pretty close to where she is.
All right. All right. Now we move into the top 10, and it's a heck of a list to be in this top 10. Um, some well-known names here: Sam Brisk, Kristen Holta, Sarah Sigmund's daughter, Kristen Clever, and Carrie Pierce. Anything you really want to say? There's really not much change here. Most of them dropped down one spot compared to last year, and the reason why is what we'll get to later on. Obviously, it's Laura Horvath, but yeah, anything worth noting about these athletes here?
Yeah, I think a couple things. First of all, Carrie Pierce and Kristen Clever, I would say, are still holding kind of the only ones holding the candle. I know that Brooke Wells and Haley Adams are right behind them and can
Mhm.
come up, but I still consider Carrie Pierce and Kristen Clever to be the top American athletes of all times. They're right next to each other there. And I mean, this is a great example of how difficult this is. And it's like,
Mhm.
if you are someone out there who feels like you've invested in time in studying the careers of both of those, and you'd rather see Carrie ahead of Kristen or Kristen ahead of Carrie, I'm not really going to argue against you on that. Like Patrick said at the start of the show, this is my list. I don't really consult with anyone else on it. I do try to, like I put it down there on paper. Go away from it for a period of time. I come back and look at it and reevaluate and try to evaluate these kind of minute decisions and details from different angles, and try to take as many different things into account as I can. But I would say that in that case of those two, the margins are super, super small. And I will even admit that I think in some cases I will bias towards, if anything, the less popular opinion. Just to kind of say, like, I know what Carrie did. Trust me, I know what Carrie did. I don't think that everyone necessarily gives credit to some of the things that Kristen did, and that, she takes a hit in some people's mind because of when she competed. But man, for those 3 years, she was so damn good, and she was setting the standard. And she was, when you think about people like Rebecca Voigt and Pacelli, and these women that and Val Vobry and Lindsay Valenzuela that came out of the West Coast, like, Kristen was the standard that they were all chasing. And a lot of people like to give this credit to Rich Froning of, in addition to all the things that he accomplished, of the precedent that he set, and that, like, like, there wouldn't be a Matt Fraser without a Rich Froning. Well, in that regard, I would say the same for Kristen Clever. Is that any of the great women that came out of California in the early, 2010 through 18 era, that's who they were looking at. That's who they were chasing. And she was untouchable for 2 years, basically, um, or a year and a half. And I don't know. So I think that's a good thing to acknowledge.
Yeah.
And then I would say Sarah Sigmundsdottir is an interesting talking point. Um, her career, in my opinion, has been somewhat unlike any other athletes. Like we talked about with Ariel Lowen, it's nice to see someone who's consistently getting better. And in the case of Sarah Sigmundsdottir, for a myriad of different reasons and explanations, and you could have an hour-long conversation about her career on its own, she's gone the other way. Her best performances at the games were right at the beginning of her career, and she's only been moving backwards since then. And the reason why I want to bring that up is Justin Medeiros. If you just immediately insert someone to a ranking based on their first 3 years, you're kind of bound to it. And what happens if that's just like unsustainable for them over time, and you're like, damn, like, did I overrate them? I would
Hmm.
rather have a little bit of margin for error. I kind of wish that I had Sarah a little bit lower on this list, maybe 10th instead of 8th. And I say, like, yeah, she was amazing for this period of time. And look, she's got 7 games qualifications. Like, that's quite a few. She only got 3 top 10s. Her average finish is the second worst of anyone in the top 10. Only Sam Briggs is less than that. And Sam obviously competed for a long a long period of time, and has and at an older age than most of the other athletes competing, which I do think is notable. Um, so I think Sarah is a good example of sometimes being like too eager or excited, or having that recency bias weigh in too much immediately upon an athlete's career starting. Like, let's just say Mal O'Brien comes back next year and she takes second place at the games to Tia. And let's just say this scenario. So now she has a seventh, a second, and a second. Let's say Laura finishes third. Are you just immediately going to put her ahead of Laura, or are you going to put her ahead of Katrin? Are you going to put her against Akara Saunders, who's got 10 games appearances? Or do you want to leave a little bit of room of error? And it's like, let's see what she can do over a period of time, and then give her the opportunity to earn her way up the leaderboard or the rankings of all time. So those are the kind of the things that I would just kind of pull out from this area to give people a chance to think about what it means to assess two athletes from a different era who have relatively similar resumes, and the kind of maybe just like caution or warning of being a little bit too eager to throw someone way up high on the list, without giving them kind of a chance to fully give us a picture of who they are as a CrossFit Games athlete.
I think that's fair enough to say. And I think a good example of that will probably be like Sarah's countrymen. When we talk about the men, would be someone like BKG in terms of like having that margin of error and then that consistency. But no, you mentioned Sam. I mean, obviously, Sam is a very popular athlete. She's at 6 right now. She dropped out the top 5 because of Laura. But like you said, it's nothing she did. I think if anything, it's a product of maybe her longevity hurt her in this instance, especially in the later part of her career where she didn't have those top finishes, or not not what we're used to seeing from Sam. Do you think that was that the case where her longevity actually hurt her?
Um, I mean, yes and no. I think that the longevity bodes very well for her overall. She
Sure.
has, I mean, again, like, her career is just,
It's amazing. For 2
it's,
years there, she was winning everything. The Open, the regionals. I mean, and like you said, that 1 year where she didn't make, because of the handstand walk, she is probably the fittest person in the world, hands down.
yeah, and she has like, and she was making the games all the way back in 2010. It was one of her
Mhm.
lower finishes, 19th. She got cut in 2019. I think it was like 18th, 17th, something right in that range. 2020 was that online year. She finished 25th. 2021, she's competing at, I think she was 39 years old or something that year.
Yep.
And she'd already done a master's, and she was the last one cut. She was 21st, but it's like, 21st at 39 years old is like, I'm more impressed with that than a lot of the women who finished inside the top 20 at 25, 28, 30 years old.
And
Um,
I believe that was a year where what they had back to back. I think was that event 6 and 7 where they had the heavy cleans where she was a bottom finish in both of those events because of the heavy cleans, and
right.
still was. I mean, that just shows you take away those events where it's a heavy lift where she's never been her specialty, and she's top 12, top 15 athlete.
Yeah, and I mean, what Patrick's talking about is she went from getting cut and being around 20th in 2010 all the way up to 4th in 2011. She misses in 2012. She wins in 2013. I think she would have won in 2014, but she didn't make the games. Then she has back-to-back fourth place finishes in those 2 years where it was Tia Katrin Sarah, Tia Katrin Sarah. And she's breathing down the necks of these up-and-coming stars of the sport that are 10 years younger than her. She's still finishing the top 10 in 2017. She misses the games and competes as a master in 2018. And then her career basically tapers off in terms of top 10 finishes at the games, even though she's still qualifying in 19, 20, and 21. So I would say the longevity plays both ways. If you took out those last 3 years, then she doesn't have the prestige of having 11 individual CrossFit Games qualifications, which is, I think I got that right. Sam Briggs, 9, excuse me, 9. 6 instead of 9 is like, it doesn't keep you in that rarefied air. But those 3 finishes are obviously 3 of her lower finishes. But she did them when she was 37, 8, and 9 years old. So I don't know. I think Sam Briggs is a legend of the sport. I think she's, you know, in many ways she's in a league of her own. And yeah, like, she was 5th last year. She's 6th this year. I think it's a great spot for her, and it is, an accurate representation of many of the different reasons that Sam Briggs is so great.
Yeah. Michael saying so happy to see Kristen Holt in the top 10. Kristen Holt is one of those athletes who just so consistent. Um, it's weird how we don't really celebrate her career as much as we do some of these others. But I think having her at 7th, previously 6th, is a good showing for someone who's never actually won the games. So it's
She has had that kind of trajectory of getting better as she went. 16th, 17th, 12th, her first 3 years, 7th, 7th, 2nd, 6th, 4th. And that string of 5 years in a row, unlike some of the other athletes, she was able to navigate the different nuances of some of those years. I would say the same thing about her second place finish in 2019 as Jamie Simmons. Would she have finished that high if the whole field had been there? Based on everything else, no, because she never was able to do it otherwise. She missed making the final 5 in 2020 by 2 points, I think it was,
mhm.
to Brooke Wells. But she had that consistency throughout her career that was pretty rare. She's her like all of her stats hold up. Eight appearances, a 9th place average over those 8 years. Five top 10s in 8 years with nothing outside of the top of 17th. She's got 5 wins at the games in individual events. Yeah, I think she's a solid pick for well within the top 10.
That brings us into the top 5. Um, Cara Saunders. You briefly you talked about Cara before. I mean, minus some her injury where she suffered basically a heat stroke from Murph that year and had to withdraw on Sunday. She could have been standing on the podium, and then obviously she took a year off due to her pregnancy. Um, you know she drops for someone who's only has a few podiums under her belt. You have her ranked really high at 5th.
Yeah, huge. I'm huge fan of hers. Just you know, in my opinion, the fittest woman who's never won the games.
Hmm.
10 appearances puts her in rarefied air. 6 top 10s. It would have been 7, and I don't think not the game site, man. She had to withdraw in 2014, obviously, and in her rookie year in 2012, she got cut. And and there's a lot of people that don't realize that cuts were going on. Plus, she's
Hmm.
had 3 different names over the course of that time period.
Yeah.
But a 19th in
Only
that rookie year was her worst finish, and then otherwise a 12th in 2013. After that, she's been inside the top 8 every single year that she's competed at the games.
yeah,
Um,
including
other than the
last
other than 2 years where she had to withdraw, she was able to bounce back from giving birth, like Annie Thorsdatter was, and come back and still compete. 6 event wins in her career. 7 event wins in her career. 6 top 10, average finish of 8th over 10 years. It's just, the resume stacks up.
year. Yeah, and who can forget that finish between her and Tia in 2017?
2 points away from winning that year.
Yeah.
An injury potentially away from winning in 2014. So she's
Mhm.
been as close as anyone who's never won.
Yeah. Um, and I forgot to mention also the last person to beat Tia in a live competition.
There you go.
Um, Moving into top 4. Okay, this is where we kind of have some people arguing here between who we have at 4 and who we have at 3. Obviously, at 3 we have you moved up 8 from 11th last year to 3rd, and then you have her moved ahead of Katrin. So this is where a lot of discrepancy, a lot of people arguing this case right here is between this spot between Katrin and Laura. And you wrote an article about this earlier, right after the games, about Laura Horvath, and I think a lot of what you wrote in that article is probably what played into your decision when it came to ranking her ahead of Katrin.
It was I was curious to see how the response would be to this because of that article. I wrote that article, and I know that the title was a question, actually.
Yes.
Is Laura the second fittest woman of all time? And it felt to me like some people thought I was saying that, without probably either, I don't know if they didn't see the question mark or they didn't read the article, but I specifically said at the end of the article that, I haven't actually answered this, and I will answer it when my updated all-time rankings come out. And, obviously I was giving some thought to it at that time. I knew that Laura, based on her performance this year and the totality of what she's now done over 6 years, was going to jump up significantly. And I was either going to put her 2, 3, or 4 on this list. Sat down and looked at it quite closely. I didn't think that she, and when that article came out, there were, some people that were like, absolutely, she's the second fittest woman of all time. And I think those people were really grasping onto the kind of thesis of that, which is, sometimes an athlete or a team happens to run up against the greatest of all time. And obviously Tia is undisputedly on the women's side the best we've ever seen. And Laura's career was starting right at the time that Tia was coming into the pinnacle of her career. Tia was coming off her first win in 2017 after a battle for 3 years, second, and then only beating, her rival from Australia by 2 points to get that title. And then that's when we really started to see the dominant Tia Toomey. But the same year, Laura Horvath shows up on the scene. And it's like, those people understand if Tia wasn't there, Laura might have 3 or 4 championships already. I think also Laura takes a big hit in the public's mind because of a extremely obvious and notable deficiency in one thing. Well, there are other athletes that have things like that just don't take the brunt of the criticism that she does because they're not as good as she is. She's so damn good at everything else that even with that one outlier bad thing, she's, consistently competing to win and always podiuming. The only 2 years that she had a podium are those only 2 years that are, frankly, they're the outliers. That's not like it's the same thing when we get to the men, and we'll talk about Fikowski and Valner. It's like, I don't hold those 2 years against them. And people can say whatever they want. No, and you could even use my own argument against me and say the athletes are out of control of the test. They have to show up and do their best. And in that year, they weren't good enough. It's like, okay, fine. If you want to hold to that, that's okay. But when I look at those 3 people in particular, Laura Horvath, Brent Fikowski, and Pat Valner, I have full confidence that if you put them up against any games field in a live competition, that they're going to be hunting for the podium more often than not. And in Laura's case, I feel even more confident than the 2 men that she'll be doing that. And that, yes, she would have won multiple times without Tia. And, some people in the comments today and it was interesting because the conversation when that article came out was mostly about Annie and Laura. And now that I've put her here, it's mostly seems to be about Laura and Katrin, which is fine. Yes. And there were people I saw in the comments that were saying 2-1. That's all I need to know. Katrin has 2 championships. Laura has 1. Katrin beat Tia twice. No one else has ever beat her. And someone saying, and if I read in the comments, well, if you want to say that was before Tia was Tia, then you're crazy. She was already the second best. It's like, no, come on, go back and watch the documentary from 2015 and 2016, especially 2016. Listen to the interviews with Tia, and then go watch an interview with her from 2018, 19, 20, 21, and you tell me that's the same athlete. If you are a fan of this sport, if you are serious about this sport and you don't understand how critical the mental component of being great in this sport is, then I would encourage you to go watch those things because you'll see that the physical potential was there, absolutely was there for her to win in 2015 and 16, Tia. And even if the rules were better in 2015, she would have won. But she didn't have that mental wherewithal, that toughness, that self-confidence and belief that is required of a champion. And she evolved and she became a different species, a different athlete, a different being out there. And I think that really started in 2018. And that's what Laura's had to compete with her entire life, or her entire life as a competitive athlete.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't consider is like they look at the data, I think, and I don't think it's there obviously, but you have to just stack up peak Laura, who we don't even actually know what peak Laura is. Was peak Laura what we see? I still think that we there's still some facets of Laura's game or fitness that can improve on, and she'll admit to that too. But I would say someone like her, where we don't know what peak Laura is, we know what peak Katrin is. We know what peak Annie is. We know what peak Tia is. Where those athletes, doesn't matter what era, in their peak, where they stack up against each other. And I think that's kind of the fun part about these lists is kind of like these fantasy matchups, very similar. And I'll use this comparison. Most people do all the time when you make comparisons against the goats, is Michael versus Kobe versus LeBron at their peak. Who wins? Who's the better player? I think that's the fun thing about it. It's very subjective. And I think I think
No,
it's
and you can,
great.
and this is good. It's a good to have this conversation. So
Yes.
if you just want to break it down, Katrin has competed at the games 10 times. Laura's got 6. Okay, Katrin has the edge there for sure.
Hmm.
Katrin's won 2 titles. We already talked about that. Laura's won 1. They both have 4 podium finishes. Their percentage of top 10 finishes is basically the same. Laura's average finish over a smaller period of time is better. And she's, in 60% of the opportunity, and actually less than that, because of the minimal number of events and that she was able to compete in 2019 and 2020. So maybe you count it as 50% of the opportunities. She's got 11 event wins to Katrin's 13. Also, Katrin's, uh, I don't, I think I have to remember this. She's either never beaten Laura at the games or she's done it once outside of 2019 and 20. 2000, what was 2018? I think
Year
they were both on the
19
podium that year. Yeah,
and
no, Laura was
2022.
second, Katrin was third.
Yep. Yep.
Katrin has not beaten Laura in a live CrossFit Games competition where they've been able to take the whole test ever. So, there's a lot. I think that I totally understand people who want to make the argument for Katrin. Obviously, in certain cases, I do defer to the longevity. There are people
Mhm.
that are well aware of the fact that am not a fan of the way that she won in 2015, not because of her own fault, because of the administration of the system by the games that year. Um, I still don't think anyone should be discounting what Katrin has done. I think it was a 6 or 7 consecutive top 6 finishes at the games. I mean, she's one of the greatest to ever do it. I just think that Laura is getting punished, sometimes unjustifiably so, for the fact that her career has overlapped with Tia's.
Yeah, and which I mean, you discussed that in your article, and for those who haven't had a chance, please go back, read that article. It's some really good stuff that Brian, with the help of some other people, were able to put together. Moving on to the second spot, no surprise here, Annie Thor's daughter. I don't really think there's really much you have to that you have to say about her. I mean, you've said so much about her to begin with in
Uh,
previous
just
things.
to just to
Yeah.
kind of put it in perspective, she has the most appearances in an individual of all time, 12. She's along with Katrin, they both have 7 top 10 finishes. Tia has 8, so she's tied for second all time on that. She's second amongst women all time on event wins. She's second for women all time on total podiums with 6 against Tia's 8. She's finished. This is kind of cool. She's finished first twice, second twice, and third twice. There's not a lot of athletes who finished all 3 spots on the podium once, let alone twice. Annie's resume is super strong. And the impact she's had on the sport is immense. It's not necessarily something to factor in, but I think that when I sat down and really asked myself this question, Annie, Laura, Katrin, this is the order that I felt comfortable with right now,
Hmm.
and I'm not interested in arguing with someone who feels differently. I think that it's okay. I think these are clearly the second, third, and fourth fittest of all time.
Yeah.
And if you want to shuffle the order around a little bit for yourself, by all means, I think that with the extent of thought that I've put into it, that this is the right order.
Yeah. And obviously, number one, there's no really no argument. Is Tia? If I can get that to go over. But yeah, I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. If they are, well, then I don't know what to say to them. But yeah, you know, Tia being one. I mean, is there at this point? Is there anything that Tia does that tarnishes her legacy outside of something disastrous? But let's say she does come back next year and she does compete and she finishes outside the podium. Um, I mean, she's still obviously number one. But does that take a little bit of shine off of her legacy?
I mean, I guess it have to be, based on circumstance.
Hmm.
It's like, is that but basically no.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. And the good thing about your top three is all three of those have been able, all three of those athletes, four if you threw Katrin in and Cara, they've all competed against each other. So we do have data of those athletes competing against each other, and I think that's a fun thing. It's like it's not like some of these other things. We'll get into the men's field where there's a lot of argument over who is the best, but in the women's side, we have seen these athletes compete against each other, so there's really no answer. I mean, there's no argument to that. Um,
Yeah.
and with that being said, we'll move over to the men. All right. Unlike what we did with the women, we're just going to start off, go right into it because a lot of people. I mean that's basically what's everyone wants to talk about. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with Matthew. He already said this already, and maybe you can address this directly. There we go. What Matthew says is, I think Brian is copping out on the real question of who is the best between Froning and Fraser. I love to hear a real discussion from him. If you include their entire careers, Froning can't be beat.
Actually, I saw Matthew's comment in there, and I messaged him privately, um,
Yeah.
just to see kind of where his head at was this. And I'll speak to Matthew directly here, and obviously anyone else who's in that camp is like, if you're committed to that, I'm not going to change your mind on it, and I'm not interested in doing that. We already at the start of this show talked about why I'm only factoring in the individual appearances at the CrossFit Games. In fact, in 2018, I wrote an article about that when Fraser had 5 years competing at the games. So he competed 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Rich competed 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And I don't know if this is still up on my YouTube or if there's an article somewhere that's I had published. Maybe I should republish it. But it was a pretty cool study because after 5 years of them each competing at the CrossFit Games as an individual, their resumes were almost identical. Every single study that I did, their wins, their margins of victory, their average finish, their average event, like it was insane how consistent and equal their resumes were after 5 years. And so, here you go. Rich decided to stop competing as an individual after 5 years. Matt
Mhm.
continued to do it for 2 more years. I don't think he necessarily wanted to. And those things are obviously in his favor. He went on to win 2 more years. Um, if you are committed to that idea, you have to go back to what we talked about earlier, and you have to start factoring in many other factors that we don't have a full set of data on. In terms of the individual side of things, we can easily see every individual competitor in the men's side from 2007 through 2023. You can't do that for the teams, so it's difficult to make an assessment. It's also really difficult to assess, because if you want to include that for Rich, then you have to include it for everybody. And if
Mhm.
you're going to include it for everybody, then you run into a host of problems that we've already addressed that, it's a totally different topic of conversation. The one thing that I will give credit to the people in the comments are, if you would have preferred that we said Brian's friends individual top 40 individual male CrossFitters of all time, yes, we could have included that one word in the title and it would eliminate this part of the conversation. What I'm saying to you, Matthew, and what I'm saying to anyone else who wants to have this conversation is that for this list, as I wrote in the article, as we wrote in the description, and as you guys are all aware of, we're only considering their performances as an individual at the CrossFit Games. And I have regularly and repeatedly made the argument that there would not be the opportunity for athletes right now that there is if not for Rich Froning. Rich Froning is the Michael Jordan. Rich Froning is the Tiger Woods. Rich Froning is the athlete that created a sustainable living for professional CrossFit athletes in this sport. He was the inspiration for guys like Fraser and hundreds and thousands of other people who've pursued excellence in this sport. You can never take away or replace or replicate the impact that Rich Froning has had on the CrossFit Games ecosystem, competitively or otherwise. Yet he has owned an affiliate since before he was a CrossFit Games champion. He's coached athletes to the CrossFit Games. He's created opportunities for media members, you know, coaches, athletes around the world of all different divisions. Like his resume off the competition floor is unmatched. I'm not talking about that. In the 7 years that Matt competed as an individual at the games compared to the 5 that Rich did, it's undisputed. Fraser was better, and he's number 1 on this list.
There it is. Boom. Again, I mean, it's your list. No one else is putting that list out there. You've defined the parameters of what you did on your list, and people, and you welcome this. You welcome people questioning you on that, and you want to hear their opinions, and you want to have these discussions. But at the end of the day, this is your list. If people want to put out their own list, that's what we asked them to do. That was one of the questions we asked there. Who do we miss? Who do we think is ranked? And put it out there. And so we appreciate the feedback. We appreciate all of that, and I know Brian does well. This is what makes the sport grow, is having conversations like this. This is how we create these superheroes, these stars within the sport, by having these conversations. There would be no Kobe Bryant without Michael Jordan. There would be no LeBron without either one of those two, and vice versa. And it's true for any sport. There's no Tom Brady without Troy Aikman or Terry Bradshaw or Joe Namath. You just go down a list. But that's the beauty of our sport, and we're so lucky to be at the infancy of the sport where we can have these arguments now, or not arguments, but these discussions now at the infancy of a state of our sport, because you don't see that in other sports. And I think that's what's so cool about this, and that's what I think is so awesome about these lists and what you're doing, Brian. And I'm saying that as a fan of the sport and a fan of what you do. So yeah, keep it coming, people. That's awesome. So all right, we answered that question. Um, so Fraser, obviously, numbers, everything. He wins the number games in terms of
Well, let's
event.
we can talk about the numbers just for the sake of it.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
sure.
7 appearances, 7 top 10s. Everyone knows he was fifth, 5 firsts, 2 seconds. Froning 5 appearances, 4 firsts and a second. They both have an average finish over their career of 1.2, so it's a wash in that regard. Fraser's got 29 career event wins to Froning's 16. 14 of them came in 2020 alone, so I would say that they're relatively on par on years where they actually had a fair number of people competing against them in terms of event wins. Fraser competed later on in the sport when there were more people of higher quality throwing their name in the ring. That's of no fault of Rich's. It's just a fact. And these two are so far ahead of everyone else that that's what makes it fun to have this conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that, the GOAT becomes this like term that is thrown around a little bit haphazardly. And I would say that depending on how you define that, you could make the argument that both of these are the GOAT. In terms of the impact on the sport from every perspective, it's Rich, and it's not even close. In terms of performance at the games, when you're talking about, they had different mentalities, they had different mindsets. I've spoken about this before. Rich wanted to win the games. Matt wanted to win every fucking event at the CrossFit Games. He hated that he won the games in 2016 with one event win and 7 second place finishes. He was trying to win by 1,000 points, and he was winning by 200 to 300. Rich trying to win. He realized that it didn't matter in the way the sport was developed, that you could win by an inch or a mile. You were either the fittest on earth or you won't. And every single year for 4 years in a row, after having one flaw, he found a way to get it done.
Yeah.
And Matt found a way to get it done that was a little bit different. So
Mhm. Yeah, I don't like I said, we can argue, and I think that's what, again, like what we said in, and this is something that will be discussed, you know, years from now until there's someone else. But the thing is, we're lucky enough in the sport to see two generational talents in Matt Froning and Matt Fraser, and I think people keep on saying that. And I think that's part of the issue. And we'll talk about that later. Is like everyone automatically started crowning Justin Medeiros as the next person to do that. Well, it's still to be determined if that happens. But we're just lucky enough to have conversations like that now in our sport, and it just shows how much our sport has grown. Another point of contention was this person that you have in third is Pat Vellner, a guy who's never won the games, that you have ranked ahead of some people that have won the games and that might have similar, somewhat resumes. You have Ben Smith and Jason Khalifa are the main people that you have him ranked ahead of. What went into that pick of having Vellner ranked ahead of two greats like Ben Smith and Jason Khalifa?
yeah, I mean, I think that at this point, I don't think there's much argument about Vellner being the fittest man who's never won the CrossFit Games. And again, he runs into a little bit of the same problem that Laura did, is that
Mhm.
during some of his best years, he was going against Fraser, the best
Yeah.
that we've ever seen.
Yeah.
But his resume is pretty damn impressive. He's got 8 consecutive qualifications to the CrossFit Games. He's knocking on the door of getting into that echelon of 9 or 10. That's extremely difficult and rare to achieve. And in those years, he's got 7 top 10 finishes. The only exception being in 2019, which was a joke, in my opinion. I think he would have finished fourth at worst that year if he'd been able to finish the competition. And in 2020, he finished ninth online with a torn groin. He would have
Mhm.
made the top 5 otherwise. He took, if you just look at the stats, I think he took a massive hit on the front squat or whatever the strength test was that year. The 1 rep max front squat, I think it was, and that eliminated him from making the top 5. Now, he wouldn't have been able to compete well with the torn groin anyway at the games. It was probably in his best interest not to make it, but a fully healthy, Pat that year would have another podium to his resume. As it is, the stats are what they are, and his average finish over the course of those 8 years is just over 5th, 7 top 10s, 4 podiums, or 5 podiums, excuse me. Is that right? 5 podiums, yeah. And 7 event wins, which is up there. I think maybe 5th or 6th all time for men. So I think that his resume, given the period of time during which he's competed, the consistency that he's shown over time, the excellence that he's had, I don't really feel, I don't want to take anything away from Ben Smith and Jason Kalipa. These guys are phenomenal. Ben Smith does have a championship. He does have 11 appearances at the games, and those 2 things are the only 2 things that he really holds over Pat. He's got more total podiums, just as many top 10s, and a less sample size, a better average finish, more event wins, has been better recently against better competition. That's not a fault of Ben Smith. That's just a fact of the state of play. Kalipa, has a similar average finish. It's slightly worse. He's got less years competing. He does have 1 championship. He's got less podiums. He's got less top 10s. He's got less event wins, and he competed a long time ago. In my opinion, there's no argument for Kalipa ahead of Vellner, and there's a minor one at best for Smith ahead of
him. No argument here. So now we get into 6 and 10. I mean,
and I would say, I do see a distinction for me, like where I said it was Fraser and Froning. I see Vellner, Smith, and Kalipa in sort of a tier of their own right now, with Medeiros having the potential to push into that tier. I thought he would push into the 3 through 5 range this year. I still don't really know what happened to him at the CrossFit Games. I'm happy with him at 7th after last year, and I didn't feel any need to move him. I'm assuming you're about to ask me about him, and I didn't feel any need to move him up this year based on his performance. I did see some questions about how can you have Panchik ahead of him, given that Panchik has more than twice as many years at the CrossFit Games. He's in the top 6 almost every single year that he competes there. He's never on the podium. This is, I would say, is like another really great example of the difficulty of assessing longevity and era versus, a brevity of excellence that Medeiros has obviously shown. I expect that Medeiros will usurp Panchik, Kalipa, and probably Smith, and maybe Vellner by the time his career is done. I just don't think he's done enough yet to warrant that. And again, I want to cite the Sarah Sigma's daughter example and say I would just caution you against putting someone who's only got 3 excellent years super, super high on the list immediately.
Yeah. I mean, so regarding, it's like what you said is a lot to digest. Regarding Justin, you didn't drop him down because of his finish this year. So you're thinking that you're hoping, or you're assuming that what happened this past year was maybe,
I can tell you this much, that when, I have not put out power rankings, worldwide power rankings for next year yet, and I will. Yeah. And Justin Medeiros, what did he finish this year? 13th at the games. He will be much higher than 13th on the power rankings for next year. It's a one-off. For me, it's a one-off. I know people were like, no, his semifinals was also bad. It's like, it's okay. Not, this is what I'm talking about, is that to be great over a long period of time is very difficult. Vellner has shown that in a capacity that Medeiros has not. To be great over 8 years instead of 3 years. Medeiros is young. Medeiros has a ton of opportunity. His potential is massive. His ceiling is still, in my opinion, unknown. We don't know what's going to happen next year and the year after. He could easily come back next year and have another podium. Maybe he gets another win. I don't know. Yeah. And if he does that, then the whole landscape of the conversation surrounding him changes. I felt really good. It was different last year when he had his first 3 finishes. I had to say, okay, he was 3rd place in 2020, and we know all the circumstances around that. And I'm already thinking about him, and I'm okay. The next year he comes and he wins, and it was somewhat of a surprise, and he did it in a really cool fashion. And I've written articles about his consistency, his execution, his discipline as a young athlete competing in this sport. It's really unparalleled. It's really uncanny. And he did that for 2 seasons, but the chinks in the armor were starting to show. He was threatened at Rogue. He had a bad performance at semis. He didn't win this year at the games, didn't even make the podium, didn't even make the top 10. So now, now I'm feeling good about the fact that I didn't just immediately put him up to fourth, because what am I going to do if suddenly this year he's got a 13th place and I'm like, damn, like that's worse than Vellner's ever done.
Mm-hmm.
And I have him ahead of him, and it's like then I end up in this like weird situation. So I like to allow, like I said earlier, for athletes to earn their stripes over time. I'm not discounting what he's done. If he retired tomorrow, then I would look at this and I would say, okay, I have to, maybe I want to think about this a little bit differently. But maybe I don't. Maybe I'm really happy with 4 years, 2 championships, an average of a 4.5 place finish, and that's making him the 7th best of all time. But that's not the scenario. I know that he still has the ambitions to compete. I still want to give him the chance to prove some things to me over time that these men ahead of him on the leaderboard have done.
Fair enough. Um, in the comments on Instagram, Lucky Zerba, question on 6 to 10. I think you already answered this question. It's the second half. I understand Justin being ahead of Brent, but why BKG and Panchik? Brent has more podiums and event wins than both of them combined. Yeah, Brent at ninth. There's no change from last year. This year he just missed out on a podium. He finished fourth. Yeah,
So basically he's asking, why don't I have Fikowski ahead of Panchik and BKG?
correct.
Fair, I mean, super fair question. I will say that this range on the leaderboard, I would say Panchik probably through Fikowski. I think you can maybe draw a line there, and I think it'd be difficult. I mean, Noah's got a good resume too, but
Mm-hmm.
this is a pretty tight range on the leaderboard, and I can totally understand people having some different opinions on this. And I was like, a part of me wanted to drop Panchik from 6 to 9 here and just put him below all of those guys, and a part of me was like, I don't know. So I will say that of all the questions that people have asked so far, this is probably the hardest one for me to answer,
Yeah,
because I do think that the margins for these people in particular is super, super, super tight. The big hit on Panchik is that he never made the podium. His
yeah,
consistency over a long period of time is something that neither BKG or both Brent Fikowski and BKG have had higher ups and lower downs than Panchik.
yeah,
So, I would say, like, this is a great question. This is a question that I can really appreciate. And if someone wanted to say, I think Brian got this one wrong, I wouldn't necessarily argue with him. If you look at their average finish over their career, and I know there are some circumstances, especially with Fikowski, where he's really being punished for basically the online 2020 games and Mary, just if we're speaking quite frankly. But it's it's 2.5 spots worse than Panchik over the course of his career. It's half a spot worse than BKG. BKG has the most appearances out of these three. All of them have at least 8. BKG has the most podium, or yeah, he has as many. BKG and Fikowski both have 2 podiums, with Fikowski obviously having the second place finish that neither of the other 2 guys have. Yeah, the margins are small here, and I think the question is great.
yeah. I think again, what you said about this has to be really close. I'm sure if there was a point system, that all these guys would probably be separated by 1 point, with the total separation of like 6 points. But I mean, it's you're talking about some of the great modern day greats, and who will probably go down as some of the all time greats, and that's the reason why you do lists like this, is so that way you can determine where these people rank stacked up against each other. And we're just very fortunate that we're in the men's field, especially, that we're seeing a lot of these great athletes outside of Froning and Fraser compete against each other at their peak and at their best. So it's been really cool.
And I think,
Lemon,
look, and I know that Medeiros, BKG, and Fikowski all have ambition of competing again this year.
mhm,
Um, and I think that, as I just mentioned, like I thought about it this year, and I think it's likely that Panchik will move down this list a few spots next year.
mhm.
And by the way, it could be, it'll be interesting to see as we're getting into the next range what happens with Adler and Roman as well.
Yeah, yeah. So moving to that next range, you bring up Roman. Roman's our first new entry. He goes from outside of the list right into 14.
He goes from not being eligible to the list,
There we go. So he wasn't on the list. I wasn't wrong, but he wasn't eligible
but
because
not
he
because of performance, just
because
because
yeah,
of criteria.
and you were
And,
basing
well,
this
and
off.
yeah, and I mean, for the people that have realized that I do put an emphasis on longevity, and that I think that it's incredibly important to and relevant for athletes to have the ability to perform well enough to make it to the games and then well at the games over a long period of time, that's why I have this minimum. And it is unfortunate in
Mhm.
sports, that I think that for diehard NBA fans, a lot of people will be like, man, I wonder how good Anthony Hardaway or Tracy McGrady or Derrick Rose would have been if they'd never gotten injured. And
Yeah,
that's just like the fact of it. Like some athletes, for whatever reason, they have this potential, and it's injury, it's life circumstance, it's pregnancy, it's a mental health thing that they're just like they aren't able to perform over a long period of time. And when you're trying to do something like this, you know, you have to have a benchmark of some kind. And for me, it's like, okay, I want to see at least 3 data points. I like 3 data points from a scientific perspective as a minimum sample size anyway for just about anything. So if Roman has now had 3 years competing at the CrossFit Games, and
live.
he's qualified 5. Well, no, not live, two
Oh yeah,
live, one
2 live.
online,
Yep.
and it's like he was 13th online in 2020. Actually won an event that year, and the 1,000-meter row.
Mhm.
But he's got, in his 2 appearances that he's had, he's a second and a third, and it very easily could have been a second and a second or a second and a first, and then that balances out with the 13th that was online. I'm really hopeful that he continues to do well over a few more years, and that 13th weighs less and less and less against him, because I don't really think it should count against him. And
Sure.
so, Roman is an athlete that I would expect to continue to climb these ranks, assuming that he continues to compete healthy.
Yeah, and we also know that, I mean, and history has shown through Roman is that he, in comparison to live competition, he doesn't do as well in online competitions versus live competitions. We've seen that in the Open, and we've seen it even in the Last Chance qualifiers, and where he didn't even win the online Asia semifinal. But obviously, when he's live, the guy is, he's a
Stas
gamer.
Solidov, I believe, won that.
Exactly, exactly. Yep, yep.
Didn't
And
show up
then
to the games for some reason.
yeah, and then the biggest jump outside of someone jumping into the rankings for the first time is Adler, who moved up from 24 to 13th. Obviously, that's a huge that's because he won the games this year. What do you what's the upside for him in terms of, let's say he finishes, I'm not going to put the pressure on him and say that he wins the games again next year. Let's say he podiums again. What are the chances of, with a podium, does Adler crack the top 10?
I just want to. I'm going to answer that question in a second. I just want to. I'm looking at this comment right here that I hadn't seen earlier. LIG go Doper.
Mhm.
Amaderos with 2 championships and 1 second should have been third by far. I love that people are interacting. I love that they're giving their opinions. If you're going to put something like that on here, be accurate. And here, Val Venice corrected him. Like, take a second. If you think like, oh, what the hell? How does he have Madeira so low? He's got 2 firsts and a second. Just take 5 seconds and go search his history and recognize that you had misremembered something, that it was 2 championships and a third. So like then that you might have a valid point, but if you're putting out inaccurate information, then it makes you look foolish in your attempt to do that. I appreciate the question. We obviously already talked about Justin, but I just noticed that, and I would say, like, please, like, this is the problem with people in general these days, is they see something, they have a thought, and then they just post it or write about it or say something without giving a little bit of thought to it. Please recognize that these lists are something that I take really seriously. And so if you want to have a thoughtful remark like that one earlier, the lucky guy, or Matt's question that he asked us, like, I appreciate the thoughtfulness of those. I appreciate challenging my point of view. I appreciate people have other points of view, but at least take a second and make sure they get the facts straight.
Unless
Back
you're
to
Jared, unless you're Jared Graybill, who's just going off emotion.
well, yeah, Jared.
Yeah, it's Jared. Anyway,
Jeff Adler.
Jeff Adler.
Yeah,
Going back to Jeff Adler.
yeah, and I know that, and there were people that are, one of the things that they were saying is like that they don't think I value championships high enough, and we saw that with Camille in some cases. We've seen that with the Sam Briggs versus Cara Saunders conversation. We saw that with Medeiros, and we've seen that with Katrin versus Laura. And it is difficult to say, like, how much more impressive is a first place than a second place? That's like that. I want people to like think about that question for a long period
Mhm.
of time.
Okay.
Um, like winning is different than losing. And that, just ask Mass Fraser about that. Like, he considers second place a loss,
Yeah.
not a second. Not that I beat 188,998 other people in the world, that I lost to one. How much harder is it to win than lose? Well, in this case for Jeff Adler, that first place weighs pretty heavily. You know, he bumps up 11 spots, like you said. And if you look at his resume over time, he's surrounded by most people that have a better average finish than him at the games, and in many cases by a notable margin. Roman, for example, even with that 13th, averages a 6th compared to Adler's 11th at the CrossFit Games over the time that he's competed there. But he has the better finish. He has the, and then you think, like, okay, well, it's not just that he's won one CrossFit Games. He also has two top 5 finishes. One of those was in 2020, which we've talked about, and his worst finish, his only bad finish, was in 2019, where he was 33rd. So I would say that the 33rd is not a good representation of his finish in 2019. He was probably better than that. The 5th in 2020 is not a good representation of his finish this year. He was probably worse than that. He was probably closer to the 13th that he had in 2021. And so I think it was with Shadburn that we were having this similar conversation,
Yeah.
where she had a bad 1 year, good the other year, and then in 21, 2, 3, maybe it's someone else, but anyway, in 21, 2, 3, 13th, 5th, and 1st. So what I'm seeing here is that probably in a uniform system, he would have been somewhere around 20th, 15th, 13th, 5th, 1st. And I've talked about this with Jeff Adler before. We wrote the article coming out of the games called The Rise of Jeff Adler. I don't think there is a better example in terms of an elite CrossFitter in our sport of what discipline over a period of time can produce in a human being. He has pursued the CrossFit methodology, like the lifestyle, in conjunction with pursuing elite excellence in the sport in a unique and commendable fashion. And I think I write about that at the end of that article, is that he can be, this is rare, he can be an example for everyone in a gym that's coming to a gym to
Hmm.
pursue health and wellness over a lifetime, just as much as he can be an example for someone who's pursuing an elite career in this sport, whatever that means for them, or maximizing their potential as a competitor in this sport. So I think that he's, stands in a unique position in that regard. And, as far as I can tell, he's continuing to get better. I have tremendous respect for him right now, just so people kind of have an understanding. He's 5 years at the games. He averages about an 11th place finish. He does have 6 event wins, which is pretty good. 3 top fives and that 1 podium, which is a win. And when you just look at some people that are around him, we already talked about Roman. You're really looking at guys like Bailey, Bridges, Olson as like the next group for him to pass by. And if you're asking, well, what would he have to do next year to do that? Yeah, I think even another top 5 finish is probably going to vault him past Bailey and Bridges. Another podium probably pushes him past Olson, and then you're getting into that realm of the Panchik, Froski, BKG. I'm expecting a bounce back from Medeiros next year that
Yeah.
will bolster his resume a little bit. But yeah, it would not be a far stretch for Adler to be inside the top 10 at this time next year.
Yeah. And we talked about how close that margins had to be for those 6 through 10. But looking at this 10 individuals here, there's some legends here. You talk about Josh, Dan, Graham, Holmberg, Matt Chan, Miko. You have a couple games champions there, including Adler. And then you have someone like Koski, who's still been around the sport for a while, who falls in that longevity thing, but he's still fairly young and definitely can move up the list. Then you have someone like Cole Sager and Travis. Well, mainly Cole, who's kind of maybe, he's at the, his 10th games, and he's probably his worst finish at the games, I believe, was this past year. Um, and then, so you have a good mixture here. My question is, of Travis Mayer, you have him at 20th. Why 20th?
That's your question.
Yeah, that's my question. Everything else was a statement. This is a question, Travis. Like, I love Travis. I think he's a great guy. And he's just
Are
awesome. But
you? You don't. I guess you don't have to answer, but like, do you think he should be higher or lower?
if it was my list, probably lower. Looking behind that list. I just want to know what you're thinking. Why Travis at 20 versus say someone like, um, sorry, it's like Samuel Quant. Why do you have Travis ahead of someone like Samuel Quant, who Quant has, obviously more top 5 finishes. He has a podium. Now, granted, are you counting that 2020 against Samuel Quant, where you finished second? Even um, someone like, even Chandler, I think maybe average finish might be better than Travis. I don't know. That's why I'm asking these type of questions.
Yeah. So Travis Mayer, he's got 8 years competing at the CrossFit
Hmm.
Games. going down from there, since we're talking about him possibly being lower, Quant's got 6, Hackenbrook 4, Saxon 5, Spencer 6, Spieler 7, Lazar 3, Hepner 5, Anderson 4, Chandler 4, Vino 6. So he's got
Hmm.
the most appearances. His average finish at the games is 16th, which is, it's worse than everyone on that list down to Chandler,
Hmm.
with Hackenbrook having the best at 10. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Lazar having the best at 8.6 over only 3 years. That's the
Hmm.
only one who, and then Hackenbrook at 10. A lot of them are like 14, 12, 13, 14 average finishes. So they're just slightly better. Um, and so, yeah, in this case, I'm basically, this is like the same principle as the Sarah Sigmund's daughter or the
Hmm.
Justin Medeiros, just lower down on the list. In the case of Tommy Hackenbrook, who's done competing, Spencer Hamda, Chris Spieler, Jacob Hepner, Alexander, who are done competing, I would just say that their average performance over a smaller period of time was marginally better than Travis, and his longevity is what elevates him against them. None of
Yeah.
those athletes outside of Spieler has a Hackenbrook and Spieler have podium finishes from the ranch era of the games.
Hmm.
And I'm definitely recognizing, like, I would say that some of Travis's finishes, even though he doesn't have those podium appearances, are on par with, like, I would say that, a 10th in 2016, a 12th in 2021 are on par with a second or a third in
During the
2008
rank.
or 2009 in terms of the difficulty of achieving that task, given the state of athletes, quantity and talent that we're trying to pursue those at that time. So that's kind of, I would say, why I have him against some of the athletes that are competing in the past. In the case of Sam Quant, Saxon Patrick's a good example. Saxon's
Hmm.
got 5 years. He's got 2 top 10s, which is more than Travis has. His average finish is 13th to Travis is 16th. And I could easily have him up there. But what happened to Saxon this year?
Hmm.
And what's going to happen to him next year? And what if we never see him again? Well, if you never see him again and he's got the 5 compared to the 8, and let's say we never see Travis again either, are you like, man, maybe I shouldn't have put him ahead of Travis so quickly? It's like, basically, I'm just allowing for the athletes that are still competing an
Hmm.
opportunity to do things that some of these guys have already done. And I would consider their careers slightly differently, knowing that they were completely done and over.
Correct.
And so I
Okay.
might say, okay, well, Saxon's only 27 years old, but he's retired. He's
Hmm.
choosing not to pursue it anymore. Right now, I think Saxon still has an opportunity to bounce back. I wouldn't be surprised if over the next 3 years we see Saxon Panchik at the games twice and he ends up in the top 10 once. Like, I think he could possibly do that. And then he could move back, move up the rankings because of it. But he might never show up again. He might never be good enough again. He might choose to just invest in his family, or he might start a different business and just say, you know what, I had a good run. I mean, even though he's only got 5 CrossFit Games appearances as an individual, he's been competing or pursuing competing in the sport for like a dozen years. Like, how long are you going to put your body through that? He's got kids, he's got a family, he's got, other interests. So I think that, and same thing with a guy like Lazar. Like, yeah, on paper, Lazar's, his event finishes, his average finish at the games is twice as good as Travis, 8th to 16th, just, rounding roughly. But he's only done it 3 years. Travis did it 8. And if you haven't picked up on it by now, I think that ability to do that over a long period of time matters.
Yeah. Well, I think you pretty much answered a lot of these. You addressed pretty much a lot of these people on the second 10 or this next set of 10, 21 through 30th. And then we have our final two new entrants into the rankings in Lazar and Chandler. And you talked about Lazar, whose average finish the last 3 years has been eighth, you said?
Yeah,
Um,
I think he's like eighth and ninth. So he's
yeah.
like, it's like 8.68 and 2/3 basically.
Hmm. Yeah. And then someone like Chandler, who's been around, but he hasn't been able to, he's cracked it. But in terms of competition, competing at the games, he only has a lot of people don't realize is he's only had what 4 appearances at the games, and that includes 2020.
He's had 4 appearances at the games, and his
Mhm.
appearances at the games are so difficult to quantify.
Yes,
So his best ever finish was 6th, which was in
yep, in
2020,
2020. Yep.
which looks great on paper. He missed making the final 5 by a point or two
Hmm.
to Adler. And Adler didn't do any better than that at the live 5. He still finished in 5th. How good was Chandler that year relative to guys like Adler, Medeiros, Quant, who made it through? How good was he relative to BKG, Vellner, and Fikowski, who didn't? I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know. Was it possible that he was a top 10 guy at the games that year? Absolutely. Was it possible that he wasn't? Absolutely. Was it possible he could have podiums? Absolutely. I mean, we just don't know.
Yeah.
2019, he was one of the last 10 guys to get cut. So all of those things that I just said stand the test of time. Was he better than Hepner and McLeod that finished in the top 10 and Will Morat? I don't know. Was he better than Fikowski and Mayer and Willie George and these guys that got cut one round before him? I don't know. We're never going to know. Was he good enough to be in the top 10 that year? Probably. You know. And then in 2021, you have this other weird situation where um, he missed.
Mhm.
He missed the cut by like a point. Again, he was 21st, and he missed the cut by like a point with 40% or 30% of whatever it was of the competition remaining. So finally, for the first time ever this year, he actually got to finish a CrossFit Games. And he
Yes.
finished 7th against a very good field, beating some
Mhm.
very good people. And circumstances are what they are, but like Lazar Jukic, like BKG, like Justin Medeiros, like whatever. So I think Chandler, of all of the athletes on this list, is the athlete that I actually have the least amount of concrete evidence of saying like, yes, he's actually this good.
Yeah.
So I would say that uh, this is probably my most theoretical ranking of what I think about Chandler compared to what I know about most of the other athletes.
And if we had Chandler on right now, Chandler would probably be like, "You're ranking me too high." No. Yeah.
He might
Yeah.
say that, and Chandler's very humble guy, and I think that he doesn't want anything given to him. He wants to earn it.
Mhm.
Um, and basically what I'm saying by putting him on this list is I think in a different set of circumstances, we could have easily seen Chandler because again, keep in mind, 2022 is the year he didn't make it, and everyone I think
Mhm.
by this point understands that he was dealing with something that was unusual and out of his control at semifinals that year, or at least to some extent out of his control. Um, I think that we could, in a different set of circumstances over the last 5 years, Chandler could have 5 top 15 finishes, 3 top
Mhm.
10s, and a top 5 to his name.
Yeah.
And
And
I
we
mean,
also we also don't take into account just kind of like um, in baseball during World War II, a lot of the top baseball players lost some of the best years of their playing career due to the military and serving their country. And I think we lost a couple of years of Chandler at the when he was serving his country. So we really truly don't know. But I think 29th is a really good spot for him. Obviously, he's probably potential one of those guys who has the most potential, and we just won't know. And hopefully, we'll be able to see more of him in the coming years. I mean, he plans on not going anywhere anytime soon. He loves CrossFit. He loves competing in it, and yeah. Moving on to the last 10, you brought up Kyle Bauer before. He leads us off. All these people, all these individuals, they are all dropped 3 spots, which is pretty makes sense because you added 3 new athletes into the fold, into the all-time rankings. But this is it's a very interesting list because what you see in this list, it's almost a kind of a division of, and this is what I was trying to get to in terms of recency bias. That maybe we are guilty and maybe you are, I don't know. But it seems like obviously a lot of the athletes that you've seen in person that you have more data on um, are more towards the front of this list, and it's pushing a lot of these athletes who were during the early Carson era are now falling back, minus someone like Lucas Hogberg and Logan Collins, and but just
even
kind of
so, I mean, their individual careers are behind them now.
yeah, correct.
And I mean, yes, yes. And I think that I think it's pretty comfortable and hard to argue that the caliber of competition is improving as we go along and as the
No
sport
argument.
continues to evolve.
Yeah.
But I think it's important not to just give up on these guys altogether. Now, as a total group, 31 through 40, I don't think there's a single athlete here that's still competing as an individual.
Logan, I believe Logan retired this year out from a team, but yeah, I believe you're correct.
No, the most amount of appearances at the CrossFit Games of anyone on this list is 6. That's Neil Maddox and Pat Barber. Obviously, 3 is the minimum.
Yeah.
Um, there are a few guys with podiums, Josh Everett being one, Lucas Hogberg being one, Jeremy Teal being one. There's actually, who's not on this list is James Fitzgerald. He's just on one of the next 10 outside, and he
Hmm.
obviously won the first ever CrossFit Games. So, the legacy guys like that are going to slide down over time. And only the ones that have these like incredibly strong resumes have a chance to kind of stay in there for a longer period of time. But on the counter side of that, there are modern day athletes like Tim Paulson, Jason Hopper, Will Morad, Jay Crouch, Colton Mertens, Guy Maero, Sam
Hmm.
Cornway, Will the Supanex, all of whom have at least 3 appearances at the games that have not cracked the top 40 yet. So if anyone thinks that I'm having this tremendous recency bias and not giving these guys their due, realize that I'm still valuing
Hmm.
Chad McKay 4 years, average of 11th place finish, and that's earning him a spot on this list against a Jason Hopper with 3 appearances and an average of 19th,
Yeah.
against Tim Paulson with 6 appearances and an average of 22nd, against and I could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Now, there's other guys that are going to be up and coming. Dallin Pepper, Nick Matthew are guys that have only 2 appearances. They average a 12th and a 16th. Dallin's, clearly a guy that, if he continues on the trajectory he's on, is going to be somewhere on this top 40 next year with only 3 appearances. How good can he possibly be on that list? Well, look where Lazar is with an eighth or ninth place every year. And Dallin's got a 19th and a 5th, and what's going to be next year? But Jason Hopper's a great example of what I've been talking about regularly throughout the show is be careful about putting people on the list or high on the list too early. A lot
Yeah.
of people were picking Hopper to podium, top 5, top 10. I know some people were fading on him this year, but way more were high on him. Now he's had one great performance, one average performance, one bad performance over 3 years. Let's see what he does over the next 3 years if he lasts that long. You never know how people are going to be able to cope with the setbacks in this sport. And then we'll have a good opportunity 1, 2, 3 years from now to, accurately get a feel of how good Jason is compared to some of these guys years gone by.
Fair enough. And speaking of recency bias, you did see Pat Barber recently, haven't you?
Pat Barber, did I see him recently? I don't know.
Was it? Didn't he compete at the Iron Games this past weekend?
Oh, no, but 2 guys named Barber did,
Yeah,
but
I
not
know.
Pat.
It's kind of a yeah.
Garrett and Jay Barber, brothers, good dudes. They came up to me after the event and had some nice things to say.
Well, that pretty much wraps us up, Brian. I know this is one of our longer episode. We actually had to combine both men and women, um, and a lot of information out there. You know, obviously that's something that you've been sitting on for a while. It's something you do every year, um, and no one else is doing it. No one's putting themselves out there to do something like that. And so, I don't know. Is there anything else
Yeah.
that you want to kind of want to state regarding the list and or anything you want to put out there? I mean, obviously, there's tons of comments. I think you've addressed most of those comments to begin with, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, just want to reiterate that I appreciate the support. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the challenges. I appreciate the questions. Obviously, I think that some people have put a little bit more thought and emphasis in it than others, and I realize that emotion drives things like this. Uh, Proximity to certain athletes or eras can be influence people's minds. I know that I'm not perfect in this assessment. I know that I'm not perfect in that regard, but I do try to give every athlete from every era a fair assessment of what they did and then stack them up against other athletes. And, this is the list that I came up with for now. Um, I think that it's pretty good. I'm sure that there are, some minor rooms for improvements, and we were even able to identify some of them as we went through this. But more than anything, just appreciate people checking it out, being engaged, and being passionate about this sport that I think we're all trying to lift up.
yeah. So Brian is currently in Michigan for stop 3 of the Pit Team Throwdown. Monday we'll be going live to kind of recap the show, go over some of the news. Again, thank you, as Brian said, all the support. You can continue to support us on Patreon. If you're not subscribed to our channel, please do. Especially get the alert for Monday when we go live. Should be going live noon Eastern. If you haven't noticed, I'm wearing a shirt, Uplift. It's from our friend here, Mark Moss. He has a pretty cool organization right here, and it's basically they do these workouts to bring awareness to mental health and suicide prevention. It's very it's a very cool thing that he's doing. I know Brian's talked to him. We've had a lot of friends that are involved with him. So if you give him a chance, give him a follow. Ask for information. It's just a really cool. It's just suicide prevention. It's one of those things that happens. Being a veteran, being someone who has tried to attempt his life, I obviously take this very to heart. So we appreciate all the support. Everyone that's been on submitting questions, we really appreciate it. And Brian, you have anything to say to close off before I? Sorry, we got a little
No,
late arrival here.
well,
You got
Nick,
some
it's
catching
always
up,
great to
Nick.
have you, even if it's for 5 seconds. Nick, we'll take you anytime, man.
Yeah.
No, yeah, Mark Moss, great guy. I've interacted with him several times, like Patrick said. Check out the cause that he's doing here. He promotes it all the time, and he's got good intentions, good motive, a good heart behind all this stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's a long episode. Thanks for sticking around. Leave comments, send me a DM. I'm open to conversations. The you know the you know Write it, think about it for 5 minutes, and then look at it again and send it to me, and I'll try to get back to you guys. But it's always fun to talk about this stuff, and I'm open to different points of view for sure.
Yeah, tune into the broadcast this weekend. You'll be seeing some stuff on our YouTube channel, or not our YouTube channel, but in our Instagram channels regarding the Pit Teen Fitness. So tune in. Brian and Joel Gadet will be bringing an action live from you in terms of a broadcast. You can see next year or the future stars, today. So please listen to Brian as he goes on this tour. Support those teenagers down there, up there in Michigan for me. And we'll see you again on Monday as we go live with another episode to recap and preview some of the stuff where Brian's going to next. So, as always, our friends, be friendly.